Hello and welcome to this edition of Cyber Chats. Joining us for today's chat is Tony Morbin, Editor-in-Chief at IT Security Guru, and Chris Jenkins, Sales Director at Proficio EMEA. In this episode, our guests are going to be discussing the evolution of the role of the CISO, what challenges and changes that 2020 have brought to the role of the CISO, especially in the light of the global COVID-19 pandemic, and what can be done to close the cybersecurity skills gap. Let's chat. While the role of a CISO has always been complex, it has evolved in recent years to tackle the ever-growing list of responsibilities. What are the major changes we've seen and what's driving this evolution?
So it's a very good and it's a very interesting question. From my perspective, through engagement with CISOs over a good number of years, if I go back to early days, I'd say most of the CISOs that probably we'd had conversations with who had grown through the ranks, they'd probably come from a very technical background, predominantly, like I say, going through the ranks. And the role has evolved so much that, you know, in regard to what the CISO is expected to do today, they're looking to have responsibility and understanding of things which are around governance, risk and compliancy. They're in control of the communication to their business, the communication to their partners, the communication to their vendors about what their strategy is. And you're kind of seeing from my perspective, you're beginning to see a role which used to be very technical. And I'm going to say technical, we're weighing it up against where we currently now be seeing is people maybe from a bit more of a business and a management perspective. So it is an evolving role. Those who are technical either have to adapt, or organizations are potentially beginning to look at bringing on board people who come from more of a management perspective or a business and a commercial perspective, and even from a governance, risk and compliancy perspective, those who sat from maybe from a legal perspective to come in and fill these roles. So it's a changing role, most definitely.
I'd totally agree with that. I mean, it is very much a case of the role has hugely expanded. You know, yes, you would traditionally have somebody who was head of IT, or maybe you know, they were heading towards a CTO type role, and then they've gone into cybersecurity. Now it's very much they're wanted to be a business enabler. Things like GDPR, where suddenly the company realized it was at risk of 4% of global turnover, made the board wake up to what is this thing, cybersecurity? We need to properly understand this. We can't just palm it off on somebody else. And so the requirement then became very much a communications one, to communicate the IT risk as a business risk. And that actually requires a slightly different skill set. So then you get the issue of, do we train up our techies to have a better business understanding, or do we bring in the MBAs or the lawyers to have a compliance mindset? And actually, different organizations are doing different things, and so both is possible. Some of the people from traditional CISO backgrounds have upped their game and really become business risk managers, and then there are people with the traditional MBAs who are making sure they have a better understanding of cyber, because everybody on the board now needs to have a basic understanding of cyber. So it's a board discussion, and therefore it's a board role. Whether it actually is a board role or not, it's a board issue.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think we've even expanded things from where we used to see people who would be taking on a CISO role. We've seen over the last, I'd say maybe 5-10 years or so, a lot of people now moving into a board level perspective who are actually sitting there from a governance, risk and compliancy perspective. And these are a set of people who kind of then have a control or the governance over what the CISO is looking to do, because you know, the people from a GRC perspective sit to the board, and that they want to make sure that everything from a security posture, whether it's to do with infrastructure or collaboration or data center or anything to do with the business, that fits under their remit to sort of tick in the box. So the CISO's role, they might have to take on being a governance, risk and compliancy based person, or they have to work with someone within the organization who holds budget and also holds sort of discretion in regard to what can and cannot be done. So it's a definite changing role, and I wouldn't surprise me if it keeps changing.
And obviously, one of the things that happens with that changing role is that because they've now got the seat at the board, because they now are expected to be a communicator. Yes, we said GDPR, compliance. That's kind of easy for the board to get their head round, but the big question, a CISO will get from the board is, so if we give you that 10 million, does that mean we're no longer at risk? And of course, the answer is no, you're still at risk. So what is the return on investment if we were to give you the 10 million? And so now one of the big problems for CISOs is, cost justifying the expenditure.
Yeah, and it's very interesting as well. I think historically, people who were sat in the security position from a CISO level were probably always seen as the people who kept the gate locked and the people that within the business said, no, we don't want to do this. However, actually now they actually have to show a return on their investment. They've got to show a value add in regard to what they are investing in and doing. So to an extent, they've got to try now have to be very much business justification driven to be able to say, I want to put this in place to protect the business, but actually this will make us more productive. It protects us. It keeps our liability intact, etc. So, it is a very much a commercial head and a security technical head, and it's a difficult job to balance.
As 2020 comes to an end, we can reflect back on the changes we've seen throughout the year. What are the biggest impacts COVID-19 has had on the cybersecurity industry?
Coronavirus has demonstrated, how we have to be able to quickly adapt to changing circumstances, and so flexibility has become hugely key. And there's different arguments about whether we've risen to the challenge or whether actually we have really succumbed to huge vulnerabilities with more ports open, and that we've saw a huge rise in coronavirus specific attacks. The scams, that people are being told that download this map of the coronavirus in your area and it's actually malware. Give to this charity to do with coronavirus. Absolutely, every scam you can think of, they have used the news agenda, and as good fishers, they have tailored it to tap your fears. And so, it has increased the number of attacks substantially. I haven't got the figures off the top of my head, but there's been really a substantial increase in attacks, specifically related to coronavirus.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting as well. So, myself, very similar to yourself, I've seen a huge increase in the amount of phishing attacks that are happening. But from the partners that I've worked with and I've been engaged with for a number of years, I've seen their cybersecurity business absolutely take off, and it's taken off because a number of companies have not put or have ever thought about this situation arising. They've been very much able to protect a number of employees who might have had a mobile laptop and that was it, but to deploy their whole staff to be working from home, they had never planned to, how do they push people to work from home? And when working from home, have exactly the same corporate security standards that they would have had if they were in the office. Those people who are working from home, if they couldn't deploy them onto a laptop and had to make them work from a home PC, which is a shared PC, which is being used throughout the day with school learning, it changed the landscape. And it's a very unfortunate situation we were in, but it has really seemed to typify how it's changed the landscape and made security almost a very, very top priority in regard to what the organization should be doing, because I don't think they get to see now what their people working from home, what they're accessing, what they're viewing, what they're doing. I don't think they have any controls over that device as well, and that's a huge worry really at the end of the day, because they spent years protecting their infrastructure and their corporate environment, and to an extent we've always talked about the security estate sort of moves to the endpoint to people, but it's a different case now when it's the whole company is now taken away from the head office and is very disparate.
Absolutely, and there are different approaches as to how people have dealt with it. Some, focusing on the end point, some focusing on sort of data-centric approaches, others in relation to, your access to the data. But I think the other big thing is that, okay, they've had to move fast, they've had to make a drastic change, and now they have to plan for the fact that it's not going to go back. That certainly I wouldn't say before next year are we going to see summer next year we're not going to see large numbers of people going back to the office, if ever.
No.
It's a fundamental shift. So having dealt with the immediate emergency, the next thing is restructuring to be able to cope with the long term. Are you going to be able to have the resources, the capability? As you say, security has become so key, and we're already suffering the skills shortage. So
Absolutely.
if cybersecurity and cybersecurity skills are going to become so much more important, where we get the people to actually deal with it, and even if we outsource, where do we get the skills in-house to know what we're outsourcing, on what basis, on your service level agreements, how to actually understand, even if you're outsourcing. So yes, for some organizations they're not going to be able to recruit the kind of skills that they need, and they will need to use managed service providers. For others, they will have to really start an education process and look at retraining existing staff, because the already trained people aren't there.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, let's call it a quandary, because I've spoken to a number of very large infrastructure partners in our industry who have now realized that going forward, the larger clients that they have, and even down to sub-enterprise, etc., are starting to make the shift and the move to think that they don't need the real estate that they had before. People are now going to start expecting as a normality, potentially working from home. So what they have as a real estate isn't required. What they have as an infrastructure within their business probably doesn't need continual investment and upgrading, because actually it's going to be something that's going to shift into the cloud. It's going to become an infrastructure in the cloud, network as a platform. So it kind of means that I think there's going to be a drop in investment from that perspective, and I think that will have a direct impact on the amount of people who are seen as technical engineers within an organization not being they're not going to be needed, because if you move to an outsource, that's an area that's not going to be covered. So we're going to start to see a shift of capital expenditure moving to operational expenditure, and I think that's where we start to see maybe where the outsourced partners and providers come into play. But like you say, it's what is the right type of partner to deliver me that sort of outsourced service? And do I go to a generalist who says I can cover your network and your collaboration and communication and security, or do you break it down into maybe 2 or 3 different partners? So it's going to be a very interesting ride to see how that all pans out and works.
Given the effect of the remote workforce has had on the industry, do you think we'll be seeing a mass switch to the cloud?
I think it's already happening, isn't it? I mean, we're seeing, everything is moving to the cloud. It wasn't that long ago people were asking, is it safe to go to the cloud? You're not really getting people asking that. You are still getting people asking, how do I safely move to the cloud? But the actual idea that the cloud is in any way less safe than on-premise. Having said that, again, there will be certain circumstances with, people's crown jewels that they actually do need to keep to themselves, and but that will be a minority. I think most things will move to the cloud, are moving to the cloud, have already moved to the cloud. There's been, we've just seen a huge acceleration this year of what was probably going to take 5 years has happened in 5 months.
Yeah. And it's another interesting point that I see, and I've had spoken to me as well, is there might be this drift and shift towards the outsourcing of services. And there is that opportunity that people move from CapEx to OpEx, but it's also the case that companies can now shift their security liability onto another part of the business, outsource that liability to someone else who's going to take up that security SLA, that security insurance at the end of the day. You know, we know that the skill gap is massive in regard to people in our market. And I just kind of think maybe that is something going forward, that companies will think, I just want to maybe take a focus in on what I'm good at, where my company's driven, what we need to achieve. And if that's an element that I can take off the books and move that liability away and that expenditure away, it makes a lot of perfect sense.
I think that there are people thinking like that, and I think in terms of moving the expenditure, that works. In terms of moving that liability, there's different aspects to that. There's your legal liability under things like GDPR. If you are the data owner, you are responsible. Just because you've outsourced it hasn't abnegated your responsibility. No doubt, you know, you will face a lesser fine if you've done all the things that you should have done, but ultimately you can't say that it's not your responsibility. But worse than that, if your organization was to suffer a major breach that destroyed the credibility of your organization, particularly something that was you know, where privacy of data was really key to what you do, then doesn't really matter what your service level agreement was with your supplier. If your business is gone, your business is gone. So,
Yeah.
you know, you ultimately you will need to take responsibility for your security. But on the practical level, yes, you can actually outsource the doing of it. But that's where I was saying that you need to have at least enough skills in-house to know what you're outsourcing, to not think you're covered, you're not, and to have service level agreements that are enforceable. And likewise, insurance. If you go to insurance policies as well, they can cover certain costs. They can cover recovery costs. If you have requirement to inform everybody on your database, that alone can take a bit of money, and you can insure that kind of cost. I don't believe you can insure for fines. And as I say, if you the big one is credibility of your organization, reputation. You can't really insure for reputation and consequential loss.
While the need for cybersecurity staff has never been more critical, there still remains a huge skills gap in the market. What can be done to help combat this gap?
I think it's a case of three things. I think you need to, first of all, drive the people within your business and then drive them up through your business to then backfill. Most definitely there needs to be more of a drive in the universities in regard to getting people. There should be more courses. I mean, there's an explosion of courses since when I was at university, and I've seen the CVs that prove it, which is fantastic. But there's also the cross-training. You know, there are a number of people who work in certain parts of different industries, whether it's the military, and these are guys who are all very, very much set up to be quite, I feel, very well used to be transitioned into our side of the market. So there are vertical places where I think we can get people to transition and re-educate and reskill and come across. We definitely should keep people within the business coming through. And yeah, I think education's good. And fortunately, I think people realise that it's a good industry to be in from a security perspective. So it's become very attractive.
Okay, and I'll take it there that you were using guys in the wider sense from the military as well, because
Yes.
we certainly have some very good ex-military women in the sector as well. No, I mean, yeah, education is great, but you know, are we just doing enough? I mean, you know, you've said universities, but it starts before that. And again, trying to get a diverse workforce, we've been getting the same sort of, you know, group of people who look like us, you know, white males. We need more women in. It's about 24% of the cybersecurity workforce, and probably only about 12% if you go on a real technical level. Then whether ethnic minorities, kids from working class backgrounds are still a minority. People aren't being taught cybersecurity at school. Should it just not be, look, this is a great career that's open to everybody. And then one other thing was youngsters who are hacking NASA from their bedroom, told, no, come and get a job in cybersecurity, go on forget the dark side, come over to us. Absolutely brilliant. And they're the equivalent of Wayne Rooney not getting in the first team and being left on the subs bench. If they've got the talent, why aren't we deploying these youngsters immediately rather than having to time serve until they can get a more job that they can get their teeth into?
We would like to thank Chris Jenkins and Tony Morbin again for joining us on this episode. If you have any questions or comments regarding any of the topics discussed today, please feel free to reach out to us at proficio.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you tune in to the next episode of Proficio Cyber Chats.